In this video, we're going to be rebuilding this Trek from our previous shorts that was in a very sad and sorry state for itself. As we stripped it down, we found more and more problems with this one, but our video here will show you us bringing it back fully into a serviceable condition and ready for many more miles of happy cycling. We installed a new bottom bracket on this because the old one was absolutely end of life. Here you can see us using our Worth torque wrench, making sure that the bottom bracket cups are anti-seized and they are then tightened to specification. As you can see, that we'll wind those in first on the drive side, taking note of the direction of the bottom bracket and then making sure that it is torqued up to spec before we then move over to the non-drive side, and we'll do the same process on that cup, installing it first snug by hand, and then as we come closer to specification you'll see it gets slightly more difficult, and then we'll have a nice click as that torque wrench is reaching its specified torque. Here we're just tightening up the chainring bolts on the crank, ready for that to be reinstalled onto the bicycle. We fitted some new parts here, a new inner ring, so that the chain would be able to glide smoothly over and give a positive riding experience for the owner. And there you can see we're refitting that straight back onto the new bottom bracket. We have first put these on with an Allen key, and then we'll torque that up to specification before we move on to any of the gear components to make sure that it's sitting exactly where it sits on the chain line. Obviously, as you torque that chain ring up, it will move in towards the frame, so we have to do the torquing of the cranks before we move on with any other installation around the gear mechs. Some bottle cage work next, installing this back onto the bike. We took it out and made sure that the threads on the frame and on the bolts were nicely anti-seized. They can be a real pain if they get stuck in the frame, so there we're just going to nip that one up, ready for cycles where the owner is choosing to take a bottle with them. And then on this bike it has a front derailleur clamp, so we're just going to install that where it was previous to the strip down, and ready then for the pump accessory which went over the top of that one. Next we're installing, just slightly out of shot there, the rear hanger and the rear derailleur before we move on to the front derailleur, and we can then carry on with the build on this one. As you can see, those parts are loosely assembled so that there's some space for us to move that around once we put a chain on. Here we're rebuilding the headset. As you will have seen from the initial strip down video, all of the bearings in this headset were absolutely end of life. The rust and corrosion was causing that steerer to be very notchy, so we've got some new bearings that we're installing there with a grease layer underneath to prevent as much as possible the ingress of dirt, and also the same on the top. In goes the bearing and then the expander cap, and then obviously we will be happy with that smooth mechanism. We carry on building the rest of the headset up, putting in place all of the FSA components there. Then we've got the spacers, and then popping back on the stem and the handlebar assembly to hold all of that nicely in place. You can see there how freely that moves. In fact, it was a little bit too free for my liking as it spun around there. We'll tighten those bolts fully when we've got some wheels back on the bike and we can assess the preload on those bearings, but it felt so much better and actually will be a lot more pleasurable to ride. It won't tramline, and you've got full range of movement back in the handlebars now, instead of the notchy, graunchy, horrible state it was in when it came to us. Here we're just putting some anti-seize in the front fork. This was quite difficult to remove. It had obviously seen quite a lot of road grime, dirt, so we're just going to make sure that that's got the best chance of being serviceable in the future. Popping in there the retaining bolt that goes through the back of the fork to remount the front caliper. We again will torque that up in the final specification torque up, but just for now you can see that the freedom of movement on that front caliper is so much cleaner and smoother than it was. This was full of grime, full of dirt, and it was absolutely terrible when it was actuating. Very sticky, very difficult to return back. We're installing new brake pads into this one. We've kept the original housings. There was nothing wrong with those, so just new inserts for that. They match the colour of the brake components nicely, so we wanted to keep that original for the owner. But these shoes are readily available, and you can fit those with the supplied very, very small 2.5mm Allen bolts. And then we pop those into the caliper, and we'll assess exactly where they need to sit once we've mounted a wheel. As you can see there, using a fresh pair of latex gloves so that we're not contaminating braking surfaces. It's always good practice to use new gloves on these components. Obviously you're handling the braking friction material, and any oils and greases that are on your hands will then transfer. So a new set of gloves for the brake components as we build that together, and then put the pads back onto that front caliper. Really was a long process to get this bike back on to safe and rideable condition. It had been left outside for a while, and it had been ridden as a commuter as well as a sportive bike, and the owner had essentially used a small bicycle repair store that wasn't specialising in race bikes, and had let quite a lot of these routine maintenance things go. So we were really pleased to get this in time before it was the final kilometres that this bike was able to ride. There you can. And now we move back to the front caliper. We're just going to reinstall the original brake cable there. There were no issues with the brake cables on this one. They were still moving freely, they weren't corroded, and had some life left in them. So we're installing those back on and just snugging up the pads while we do that. Making sure that the adjuster is free. Again, anti-seizing that before it went in so that it's likely to be movable in the future. They have a tendency to get stuck, although they're not so bad on the later Ultegra calipers. Some of the earlier ones were very prone to corroding and being impossible to adjust without heavy tooling. The gear cables did, however, need to be replaced. They were corroded and they were not providing a very smooth action. The cables at the ends were very frayed, and so we have replaced those, pulling the original ones out of the housing that goes under that bar tape. The owner wanted to keep the bar tape, so we've left that in place, and then we are threading the new cables directly through that. Quite a fiddly job, but these do have small windows on them on the sides of the shifters, so there is a window that you can pop out to help move the cable through the shifter and then guide it into the existing hosing as you feed it through, and there you can see it pops out at the end, and we're able to just pull it through as you would expect. Then, just to make sure that the cable is being actuated nicely by the shifter, you'll see that I'm just applying a little bit of tension to the end of that cable and clicking through the gears before I replace that rubber hood and put that back into its natural position. Important to do that because those hoods sometimes can gum up on the mechanism and you will not get a smooth shifting process, and you're not always sure exactly what's happened. So there you can see that we've folded it just so that we can get the movement through that shifter. Once all of that's nice, we put the hood back down and carry on threading that cable. We'd like to have ideally crossed these cables over, but that was not possible on this one. So it's gone down the down tube, making sure again that those top adjusters were free, and then we're feeding these along through the bottom bracket cable guides into their relevant positions. It felt so much smoother with the new cables, and there you can see once it's nipped up, a nice free moving and clearly actuating rear derailleur. Went back round to the back of the bike there and just fitted again using the existing cable, fitted that back into the caliper and nipped that up just until we've got the rear wheel in place. We'll do the same with the front and the rear wheel in situ, making sure that the pads are aligned absolutely spot on and that the travel on both sides of the wheel is exact, so that that wheel will not be bent and pushed over as you're applying the braking force. They have very small adjusters on these calipers, so you can actually tune them in perfectly. Next, we are installing the cassette. A new cassette's going on this one, correctly torqued up to specification. And that's also a new rear wheel. If you remember, the original wheels on this bike had rolled their last mile. The rims were dangerously low, so we have sourced a second-hand set of wheels to keep the costs sensible. Lovely wheel, this one. Put some new Vittora tyres on it, new Pirelli inner tubes to give a completely new rolling package on the front and the rear. And then we're going through and doing the final torque up. There you can see us tightening up those stem bolts, and we went through that whole bike making sure everything was nice and tight. Thank you very much for watching. We really do hope that you've enjoyed this epic rebuild on this Trek. The customer will be delighted when it goes back to them. If you would love to see more of this content, please do like and subscribe. You can find the links in the video here.